They asked me what the hardest part was. It wasn't losing him. It wasn't losing the apartment. He dropped our daughter at daycare 40 minutes before the steel let go. They paid me $41,000 to never say his name again.
That boy Ruth raised in this house, Joe, he put a man in the ground to save a nickel. And then he came knocking on your door like a lost lamb.
It was him. The whole time, it was him.
This house was never about the walls, Gerald.
She was carrying a mattress down Marlowe Street at 4:17 in the afternoon. No dolly, no truck, nobody helping. Just a woman with both arms wrapped around a queen-size mattress folded against her chest, dragging it 3 feet at a time, stopping every half block to fix her grip. Beside her walked a girl, maybe 6 years old, holding a black trash bag with both hands. The bag was almost as big as she was. She never complained. She never asked to rest. She just walked. A black car slowed 2 blocks behind them. The man in the back seat did not tell his driver to stop because of the woman. He told him to stop because of the street sign. He knew that name. He knew it the way you know the sound of your own mother's voice years after she's gone. Marlowe Street. He had grown up on that block, and he already knew, without letting himself finish the thought, exactly which house that woman was walking toward. Now, before we go any further, I need you to hold on to one thing, because everything about to happen turns on a secret that neither of them knew yet. The woman didn't know who used to live in the house she'd just bought, and the man in the car didn't know that the same company that made him rich was the reason she was carrying everything she owned down the street on her back. 2 strangers, 1 block, and a truth sitting between them like a live wire nobody had touched in years. Let me tell you how they got there. Her name was Taraji, and she had been carrying that mattress for 11 blocks. She'd started over on Franklin Avenue at 3:45, with the mattress balanced across her shoulders and her daughter walking beside her. By the 4th block, her arms had stopped shaking, not because it got easier, because her body just gave up complaining. It moved past the part where the muscles protest and into the part where they simply do what they're told because there is no other choice. The mattress weighed 62 pounds. Taraji weighed 128. She hadn't eaten since the night before, and that had been half a sleeve of crackers she split with her daughter, because the crackers were the last thing in the cabinet, and Nia hadn't eaten since lunch at school. So the mattress wasn't heavy the way furniture is heavy. It was heavy the way the last thing you own is heavy. Because if she set it down and couldn't pick it back up, there was nothing after it. No second trip, no storage unit, nobody coming back with a truck. This was everything left of the life she'd built for her little girl, and she was carrying it on her back through a city that had already decided she didn't fit inside it anymore. She stopped at the 7th block and leaned the mattress against a brick wall and breathed. The sheet she'd wrapped around it was slipping at the corner. She tucked it back in. Her hands were raw. There was a bruise across her right knuckles she'd gotten 2 hours before, when the mattress caught the edge of a doorframe on the way out of the apartment that used to be hers. Nia stood beside her and didn't say a word. She didn't ask if they were almost there. She didn't ask why they were walking or where they were going. She just held up the bag with both hands and waited for her mother to pick the mattress back up. She was 6 years old, and she had already moved 4 times in 3 years, and she had learned to read the exact look on her mother's face when Taraji was deciding how much further she could go. She'd learned not to interrupt that math. She'd learned that her job in these moments was to be small and quiet and ready to walk when the walking started again. That's not how a 6-year-old is supposed to behave. That's how somebody behaves when the world has taught them, over and over, that nothing stays. And every time Taraji noticed it, she pushed the thought down because she couldn't afford to feel it in the daylight. She felt it at night, after Nia was asleep, in the dark. That was the only time she let the thing she couldn't carry come and sit on her chest. She picked the mattress back up. Marlowe Street was 3 blocks ahead, then 2, then 1. Now here's where I have to take you back. Because to understand why a working mother ended up dragging a mattress through the middle of a city, you have to understand how fast a whole life can come apart when there was never any cushion under it to begin with. 3 years earlier, Taraji had a husband. His name was Elijah. He was an iron worker, and he was good at it. And he was proud of it in the quiet way men are proud of work that leaves their hands rough. He made enough that Taraji could work part-time at the elementary school cafeteria and still be home when Nia got off the bus. They weren't rich. They weren't even comfortable. But the math worked. Every month the math worked, and when you've lived close to the edge your whole life, a month where the math works feels like winning. Elijah died on a Tuesday morning in October. He was working the 9th floor of a mixed-use tower going up on Vernon Avenue. The scaffolding on the east face gave way at the connection points and 3 men fell. 2 of them lived. Elijah did not. He was 33 years old. He had dropped Nia at daycare 40 minutes before the steel let go. And here is the part I need you to remember because it comes back around. That scaffolding did not fail by accident. But nobody would say that out loud for a long, long time. The company that owned that job site was called Meridian Development Partners, and the man who ran Meridian Development Partners was the man now sitting in a black car on Marlowe Street. Taraji didn't know his name. Not then. To Meridian, Elijah wasn't a man. He was a settlement. A number reviewed by lawyers, offered quietly, and signed at a kitchen table by a widow who was too shattered to fight and too broke to hire someone who would. $41,000. It covered the funeral, 6 months of rent, and the balance on the truck. After that, the math was Taraji's alone, and Taraji's math had lost its load-bearing wall. Losing Elijah didn't just cost her a husband, it cost her the whole structure. Her hours at the school had never come with insurance. Elijah's job had carried the insurance. When he died, the coverage died with him. Nia had asthma, and the inhaler that kept her breathing cost $87 a month without it. Taraji made that work for 2 months. The 3rd month, she sold the truck. She got $1,100 for it. And that money bought 3 months of medicine and 2 months of groceries and 1 emergency room visit at 2 in the morning in February. When Nia had an attack and Taraji had to carry her 6 blocks to the hospital because she no longer had anything to drive. That's how it goes, not all at once. Steady for a while and then short leg goes. Steady for a while and then all at once. Income drops, insurance lapses. And one day a white envelope shows up in the mailbox. The envelope came 72 hours before Taraji carried that mattress down Marlowe Street. It was a plain letter, no signature required, from a property management company. It said the building had been sold to a development group, and every tenant had 30 days to be out. She read it 4 times. She'd lived in that apartment for 4 years. She'd signed the lease the week before Nia was born, and she had picked it because the bedroom window faced east and got the morning light. Because she'd read somewhere that morning light helped babies sleep. She never checked if it was true. She just wanted it to be true, so she believed it, and Nia slept fine, and Taraji never questioned the reason. She called the management company. She got a recording. She left a message. Nobody called back. She took a bus 40 minutes to their office, and a woman behind a desk told her that extensions weren't available, that the 30 days were firm, and that there were resources for tenants in transition. She said that word the way people say it when they mean something is ending, but they don't want to be the one who says so. And here is what Taraji did not know, standing at that desk. The development group that had bought her building was Meridian. The same name on the settlement paperwork buried in the drawer at home. The same company that had cut corners on the scaffolding that killed her husband was now, 3 years later, putting her and her daughter out on the street. She didn't know. Meridian owned so many shells and holding names that even the letter didn't say the word. But it was true. The same hand that took her husband was taking her home. And that hand belonged to a man who had never once had to learn her name. So Taraji sat at her kitchen table, and she made a list of what she could carry. What she couldn't carry was most of it. The bookshelf her own mother had given her. The kitchen table with the short leg she'd fixed years ago with a folded napkin. The napkin still there, still doing its job. She could carry what her 2 hands could hold, and what Nia's 2 hands could hold. And one thing more, one large thing that wouldn't fit in a bag. She kept the mattress. Not because it was worth anything, because it was the surface her daughter slept on every single night, and whatever else Taraji couldn't give her, she could give her that. One night with the same softness under her that she'd had the night before. One thing that stayed the same when everything else came apart. But there's a second thing you're wondering, and you're right to wonder it. How does a woman with nothing end up owning a house at all? Here's how. The week before the envelope came, Taraji had gone to a free workshop at the public library, something about housing resources for low-income families. Most of it didn't apply to her. Her income was too low for a mortgage, her credit had been wrecked by a medical bill she couldn't pay in time, and she had no co-signer in the world. But near the end, the presenter mentioned tax lien auctions. When a property owner stops paying taxes long enough, the city puts the debt up for sale. And sometimes, for a few hundred or a few $1,000s, you could buy a whole house. They were almost always wrecks. Half of them weren't fit to live in. The presenter said the word risk 4 times in 2 minutes. Taraji went home and searched the city's auction list. 7 properties. She could afford exactly one of them. 1428 Marlowe Street. Listed at $2,800 for 9 years of unpaid taxes. She had never seen the house. She didn't know the neighborhood, the roof, the pipes, the wiring. She knew only that it had an address and a deed that could become hers, and that once it was hers, nobody could ever hand her a letter and tell her to leave again. She paid in cash, 57 $20 bills she'd been saving in an envelope inside her pillowcase for 2 years. 3 weeks later, the deed came in the mail with her name on it. And that is why, on a Tuesday afternoon, Taraji was walking down Marlowe Street with a mattress on her back and her daughter beside her, toward a house she had never once set foot inside. Now let's get back to the man in the car. Because his story and her story were about to collide on a cracked sidewalk, and neither of them saw it coming. His name was Gerald Ashford, and by any measure the world uses, he had won. He was the founder and chairman of Meridian Development Partners, 14 projects in 11 years, over 900 residential units across the city. The kind of glass towers people drove past and recognized, with his firm's name lit up on the side. Magazines wrote profiles. The city gave him awards. He had spent 22 years building a life where nothing that happened outside the glass had to reach him unless he decided it should. He was on a call when the car turned onto Marlowe. A deal in the Arts District, 14 units. The numbers were clean. He was watching the city slide past through tinted windows and only half listening to his attorney, and something crossed the corner of his eye the way a smudge crosses a clean spreadsheet, not big, not dramatic. Just wrong enough to pull at him before his brain could explain why. A woman carrying a mattress, alone, bent under it like a tree leaning into a wind it had been fighting too long, a child beside her with a trash bag. Gerald watched them for about 4 seconds, and he did not feel pity, and he did not feel the urge to help. What he felt was something closer to recognition, though he couldn't have named it. His eyes slid past the woman, past the child, to the green sign at the corner. Marlowe Street. And then to the numbers on the houses. And he already knew, before he could read it, what number that woman was going to stop at, because he had grown up at 1428 Marlowe Street. It was the first address his feet had ever known, and he had not stood on that sidewalk in 19 years. "Stop the car," he said. He didn't raise his voice, but the driver had never heard that particular weight in it before, and the car stopped. Gerald ended the call without saying goodbye. He opened the door, and the heat of the afternoon came in all at once, along with the sound of a city he'd been driving through for years without ever once slowing down to hear. He did not follow her, not yet. He just stood on a sidewalk that used to be his and watched a stranger carry a mattress toward the house his mother had built. Because here is what Gerald knew about that house, and what Taraji did not. Ruth Ashford bought 1428 Marlowe Street when Gerald was 4 years old and she was 26. She was a nurse's aide who worked the overnight shift at the county hospital, 11 at night to 7 in the morning, because the overnight differential paid an extra $1.65 an hour, and over the course of a year, $1.65 an hour was the difference between making the mortgage and not. She had no cosigner. She had no husband. Gerald's father had left before Gerald was born, quietly, and Ruth never spoke of him because she declined to discuss a man who had declined to stay. The house was small, 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, a kitchen that opened onto a back porch just big enough for 2 chairs. It had a crack in the foundation the inspector had flagged and Ruth had decided was manageable. She sealed it herself. She patched the roof herself. She planted mint and rosemary in the window boxes because they'd grow in any light, and because they made the kitchen smell like something on purpose. And every 3 years, on a Saturday morning, she painted the front door the same deep, saturated blue from the same paint card she'd held up to the light for 2 full minutes before she chose it, 20-some years ago. She kept a wooden folding chair on the front porch. She sat in it every Sunday evening after her shift. Not because the neighborhood was the kind of place where sitting outside was relaxing. She sat there because Gerald's bedroom window faced the porch, and on Sunday nights he'd look out, and she wanted him to see her there. She wanted him to look out his window before school started and know she wasn't going anywhere. She kept that chair on that porch for 13 years, tightening its joints with a screwdriver every summer when the wood swelled. She never replaced it. She maintained it. And to her, the difference between those two words meant everything. Gerald was 9 the first time he asked her why their house was so small compared to the houses his friends lived in. Ruth was at the stove. She didn't turn around. She said 7 words. A home is not the walls, Gerald. A home is the decision to stay. Then she kept cooking. He was 9. He didn't understand it. He filed it away in the place where children keep the things their mothers say, that they suspect they'll need later. He would need it 30 years later, standing on a sidewalk watching a stranger unlock his mother's door. Ruth got sick when Gerald was 22. Lung cancer, though she'd never smoked a day, and the doctors called it environmental. 2 decades of overnight shifts in an old hospital with aging ventilation. She didn't tell him right away. When she did, it was on the phone in the same calm, organized voice she used for everything. She kept working the overnight until 2 weeks before she died. Gerald was already gone by then, an analyst at a real estate firm 3 states away, chasing the exact opposite of the life she'd given him. He flew back on a Thursday. She had died on the Wednesday. He arrived 13 hours after she stopped breathing, in time for the silence, not in time for the last of her voice. He didn't speak at the funeral. Afterward, he locked the front door of the house on Marlowe Street, put the key in his coat pocket, and walked to the bus stop his mother had walked to every night for 19 years. He flew back and started building, and he never once came back. He never sold the house, and he never rented it. He just locked it and left it. And year after year, the taxes went unpaid, and the paint peeled off the blue door down to bare wood, and the house sat there, waiting for a boy who decided it was easier to leave a door locked than to open it and find the room behind it empty. 7 years ago, the house had crossed his desk. His own company ran a portfolio review of that neighborhood, and there it was, listed as a distressed property, delinquent taxes, eligible for a tax lien. His analyst recommended letting it go. Not worth the renovation against the projected returns. Gerald read the file, and he closed it, and he told himself that was a financial decision. It was not a financial decision. It was the decision of a man who could not open that door without seeing his mother on the other side of it, so he chose never to open the door at all. And that right there is the terrible symmetry at the heart of this. Because while Gerald Ashford let his own mother's home rot for 19 years, unable to face one small house, his company was buying up hundreds of other people's homes, renovating them, pricing the old tenants out, and moving on. He couldn't keep the one house that made him. But he sold 900 that made other people who they were. That's not a man who didn't care about homes. That's a man who cared so much about one that he made himself numb to all the rest. Taraji reached the front steps. She set the mattress down. She took a padlock key out of her coat pocket. The city had chained the door when it went into the Leanson system. She turned the key. The door opened, and she carried the mattress inside, and Nia followed her, and the door stayed open behind them. Gerald did not move. He stood 60 feet away with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the open door of his mother's house, and he could not make himself walk toward it. Inside, the living room was dark. The windows were intact but caked with 19 years of grime, and the afternoon came through them as a gray wash that turned everything the color of an old newspaper. The floor was hardwood, warped in places, but solid under her feet. Solid the way old floors are when they were laid by someone who knew what they were doing. Taraji looked at the walls, and where the paint had chipped, she could see the layers. Blue underneath, then cream, then yellow, then blue again. Somebody had painted this room over and over across many years, and twice they'd chosen the same blue, which meant the blue was not an accident. It was a decision. It was somebody saying, this is the color this room is supposed to be, and I am going to keep making it that color for as long as I'm here. Taraji didn't know a single thing about the woman who chose that blue, but she stood in that living room with her mattress on the floor and her daughter in the doorway, and she understood something anyway. Somebody had loved this house. Somebody had stayed, and the house was still standing. Hamma, Nia's voice came from upstairs. There's stars on the ceiling. Taraji climbed the stairs. In the small back bedroom, Nia was lying on her back on the bare floor, looking up, and on the ceiling glow-in-the-dark stars, dozens of them. Not scattered, arranged in careful clusters in the shapes of real constellations, placed by someone who knew where the stars were supposed to go. The adhesive had yellowed. A few had fallen and lay on the floor like plastic promises that hadn't quite held, but most of them were still up there, still stuck. In the dark, they'd still glow faintly enough. Taraji stood in the doorway of the room that had been Gerald's, and looked at the sky his mother had made for him, and she said, "This is your room. Hit baby. And Nia looked at the ceiling and didn't say anything, because the stars said it for her. That evening, a stranger in a dark suit knocks off from the open front door. 2 knocks. Not loud, not timid. The knock of a man who didn't know what he was doing there, but had decided to find out anyway. Taraji came down the stairs and stopped 2 steps from the bottom. She held the banister. She did not come closer. Every experience she'd had in 3 years with men in suits had ended with her losing something. I grew up in this house, Gerald said. Haji looked at the peeling wallpaper, at the photograph of a woman in a nurse's uniform she'd found wedged behind a cabinet and set out on the shelf, at this stranger on her porch. And now I own it, she said. I'm not here to take it back. His eyes weren't even on her. They were on the hallway behind her, on something she couldn't see, because it wasn't in the house anymore. It was only in his memory, and his memory was the only place it still lived. Then why are you here? He didn't have an answer, because the honest answer would have required him to admit something he'd been running from for 19 years. So he said nothing, and after a while he left. At the bottom of the porch steps, he stopped and turned around. The 3rd step from the bottom is loose, he said. There's a tin box under it. It's mine. I'll come back for it. And then he was gone. Now, you're waiting for the reckoning. You're waiting for the moment this man pays for what his company did. It's coming. But it didn't come from Gerald. It came from an old woman next door. Her name was Della Monroe, and she had lived at 1426 Marlowe Street for 49 years. She had known Ruth Ashford. Not well, the way neighbors know each other, through proximity and repetition. 2 women raising sons 18 feet apart under the same hard circumstances. Della had watched Ruth paint that blue door on Saturday mornings. She'd seen her walk to the bus stop every night in her white shoes and come home every morning and sit on that porch for 10 minutes before going in so the house would know she was home. Della came over on the 3rd day Taraji was there, and she stood at the bottom of the porch steps and told her all of it. About Ruth, about the boy she raised alone. About the chair. And then she said something that changed everything. That boy grew up and got rich, Della said, and her voice went flat and hard. Real estate. Big towers downtown, Meridian, they call it now. She out at the street, and you know what killed my great-nephew? Scaffolding came down on a Meridian job on Vernon Avenue 3 years back. They said it was an accident. But my nephew worked that site, and he told me before he passed that the safety inspector wrote it up twice. Twice. Said those connections weren't rated for the load, and Meridian buried the report and kept building, because stopping cost money. She looked at Taraji. That boy Ruth raised in this house. He put a man in the ground to save a nickel. And then he came knocking on your door like a lost lamb. Taraji stood very still. Vernon Avenue, scaffolding, 3 years back. She went inside without a word, and she got down on her knees, and she opened the drawer where she kept the folder she'd carried through 4 moves and never once looked at, because looking at it hurt too much. Elijah's death certificate, the settlement. And on the settlement, in small gray letters at the bottom, the name of the company that had paid her $41,000 to make a widow go quiet. Meridian Development Partners. The same man who had knocked on her door and told her he grew up in that house. His company had killed her husband, his cost-cutting, his nickel, and then his company had put her out of her apartment. And then his abandoned childhood home was the one thing she'd been able to afford with everything she had left. Every thread in her whole broken life ran back through one man's hands. She could have burned the house down. She could have screamed. Instead, she did something harder and smarter. She called the one number Della gave her, a local reporter named Trevor Dunn, who'd been trying for 2 years to prove what everybody on Vernon Avenue already knew, and Taraji handed him the piece he'd never had. A widow, a paper trail, and a buried inspector's report that Della's nephew had photographed on his phone before he died, and that Della had been keeping in a shoebox for 3 years, waiting for someone to care. The story ran on a Sunday. The headline was simple: developer buried safety report before fatal collapse and let his own mother's home rot while evicting hundreds, and it did not stop. Because once one thread pulls, they all pull. The buried report triggered a reopened investigation. The reopened investigations triggered subpoenas. Meridian's investors, who could stomach a lot of things but not a criminal negligence probe on the front page, began pulling out of the flagship deal, the very tower on Vernon Avenue, half built on the ground where Elijah Caraway died. The city froze the permits. The board, who had smiled at Gerald's galas for 11 years, called an emergency meeting and voted in 90 minutes to remove him as chairman of the company that carried his name. He lost the tower, he lost the company, he lost the awards, the profiles, the smiling board, the tinted glass. Civil suits lined up like planes on a runway. His name, which had been lit up on the side of buildings all over the city, started coming down one sign at a time. The man who had spent 22 years making sure nothing outside the glass could reach him watched the glass shatter, and there was nowhere left to stand where it couldn't cut him. That is the price, and he paid all of it. But the story isn't over, because a punishment that only takes things away isn't the same as a man understanding what he did, and Gerald Ashford still had to open a box. He came back to Marlowe Street on a gray afternoon, after the headlines, after the vote, after the whole scaffolding of his life had come down at the connection points. He didn't come in a black car. He didn't come in a suit. He came alone, and he stood on the porch, and Taraji came to the door and looked at him through the screen, and she did not open it. "I know what my company did to your husband," he said. His voice was not the voice from the car. "I read the report, my report. It had my initials on the routing slip, and I never even read it, because reading it would have cost me money and time, and I had trained myself not to look at anything that cost me money and time." He stopped. "I didn't know his name. I want you to understand how much worse that makes it. I didn't hate him. I didn't even know he existed. He was a line item, and I optimized him away. And then I put you out of your home without knowing your name either. And then I stood on this porch and told you I grew up here, like that made me something other than the man who did all of that." Taraji didn't answer. She just watched him, the way she'd learned to watch people who told her things she needed to verify before she'd believe them. "There's a box under the third step," he said. "May I?" She let him in. He pried up the third step from the bottom, and it came apart in two pieces, and wedged in the framing underneath was a tin box, blue, dented at one corner, exactly where his mother had put it the year she bought the house. He carried it out to the porch and sat down on the top step and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice, in his mother's small, even handwriting that never crossed anything out. His name at the top, just his name. She'd written about the day she bought the house. About the loan she wasn't sure she could pay. About the first night when she'd carried a donated mattress 3 blocks from the church because she couldn't afford a delivery and wouldn't ask for help, and laid it on the living room floor and watched her son fall asleep before she'd even finished making the bed. She wrote that she'd lain down next to him in the dark and listened to the house settle and decided right then that they were going to be all right. She wrote about the blue door and chair on the porch and why she sat in it, even though she never planned to explain it out loud. And at the bottom, she'd written one last line. "This house was never about the walls, Gerald. It was about you knowing you had somewhere to come back to. If you're reading this, you came back. That's all I ever needed." Gerald Ashford, who had not cried at his mother's funeral, who had not cried when the board took his name off the door, sat on the porch of the house she built and put his face in his hands. And he understood, 19 years too late, that his mother had spent her whole life carrying a mattress, that she was Taraji, that the woman he'd stepped over in the street was the exact person his mother had. And the exact person he'd spent his career optimizing away. He had become the thing his mother's whole life had stood against, and he'd done it in a house he couldn't even bring himself to enter. He offered Taraji money. Of course he did. It was the only language he'd spoken for 22 years. She said no. "I'm not going to stand outside and watch somebody fix my house for me," she said. "If I didn't earn it, it isn't mine." And Gerald flinched because those were almost his mother's exact words, spoken across 30 years in a different woman's mouth in the same kitchen. So he didn't write a check. He got a contractor to teach them, and then he showed up on Saturdays in jeans he had to buy because he didn't own any. And he worked. Not to be forgiven, Taraji made it clear that wasn't on the table, and she was right, and she never pretended otherwise. He worked because it was the only honest thing left he could do with his 2 hands. He sanded floors badly. He learned to hang drywall slower than the apprentice. Taraji worked circles around him because she'd been surviving on grit for 3 years, and he'd been surviving on other people's labor for 22. And Nia swept the sawdust with a broom taller than she was, and Della sat on her own porch and watched and made sure everybody knew she was watching. He faced his civil suits, and he did not fight them. He settled with the other families from the Vernon Avenue collapse, publicly, on their terms, and it took most of what he had. He signed a statement admitting the report had been buried, and he did not let his lawyers soften a word of it. What was left of his fortune went where it should have gone years ago. The man who used to write checks from behind tinted glass spent his Saturdays on his knees on a hardwood floor, in a house he no longer owned, sanding away 19 years of his own absence. And it was not enough to fix what he'd broken, and he knew it, and that knowing was the truest punishment of all. House was finished on a Saturday in October. The floors were sealed, the roof held, the plumbing ran clean, and the front door was blue. Taraji had chosen the color herself from a card at the hardware store on Kingsley Avenue, holding it up to the light for a long time before she decided. She did not know it had ever been blue before. She just knew a door like that wanted to be blue. When Gerald saw it, he didn't say anything. He didn't have the right to. Taraji found a wooden folding chair at a second-hand shop and set it on the porch, in the spot where the old floorboards still showed 2 worn impressions from a chair that had sat there for 13 years. She didn't know the history. She just thought a porch needed a chair. Della saw where she'd put it and had to go inside for a minute. And upstairs in the back bedroom, Nia stood on her bed and pressed new glow-in-the-dark stars into the ceiling with both hands. Not in the shapes Ruth had chosen. Her own shapes, her own constellations, her own sky. And the old mattress was still in that room, on a proper bed frame now, and most nights Nia slept on the frame, but some nights she asked to sleep on the mattress instead, and Taraji never asked why. She knew. Sometimes you hold on to a thing not because you need it, but because it's proof you survived needing it. And the first cool evening in the new house, Taraji sat down in the chair on the porch. The blue door was at her back. The light in her daughter's room was on. Somewhere down the block, a man who used to own the whole world and now owned almost nothing was learning, far too late, the only lesson his mother had ever tried to teach him. And Taraji looked out at the street she wasn't leaving, at the house that couldn't put her out, and for the first time in 3 years, she was not doing math. She was just home. So let me leave you with the thing that's been sitting under all of this. One of these people built towers, and the city gave him awards for it. The other one carried a mattress 11 blocks on her back, and not one car stopped, and not one person asked if she needed help. The cruelest thing about people like Taraji isn't what they endure, it's how invisible the enduring is. She walked 11 blocks in broad daylight carrying everything she had left, and hundreds of people looked right past her, not because they were cruel, but because we've all been trained to look past certain kinds of struggle, the same way we've been trained to look past certain houses on certain streets. There is a house near you right now that somebody is trying to turn back into a home. You've driven past it, you didn't slow down, and there is someone in your life carrying something heavy, all alone, and not asking for help. Not because they don't need it, but because they stopped expecting it a long time ago. If this story made you think of that person, don't just close it and move on. Send it to them. Tell them you see it. Because the man in this story lost everything he had before he finally understood what his mother understood for free from the very beginning. A home is not the walls. A home is the decision to stay. And the people who look past a woman carrying a mattress are, every single one of them, one bad October away from carrying one themselves. This is a work of fiction. The names, characters, and events are entirely imagined. But some version of it is happening right now, in every city in this country. If it moved you, sit with that, and let it change what you notice tomorrow.